Continuing, as children get beyond age 1, especially as they begin to reach 2, that's the point where you're supposed to be, is a little more nuanced in how you are to interact with your child as a parent or other adult. Prior to 1, you're more so available to them on demand. When the baby gets the baby wants, they're crying, etc. You have to give them attention and help them out because they're totally dependent on you. But as children grow, they become more independent, and it is the duty of a proper parent to extend increasingly more opportunity and independence as they age. And we'll talk about why that's beneficial as we go through this. Certainly, by age 2 and from age 2 to 4, it is the role of the parents primarily to socialize children. There was a sort of, how would you phrase this, long-standing debate about how to address childhood development, what sort of impact you had as a parent. It turns out that there is a substantial impact that parents have, but the abilities and preferences and motivations of people, not just children, but people as they grow, are largely biologically driven. But you do have some impact as a parent as far as socializing them and providing them with a stable structure to allow for normal pro-social development. So again, the role, especially after 2, so you could say 2 to 4, the role of developmental focus is on socialization. And we'll talk about the various genetic components as far as development and personality, like we already have, as well as the environmental. And this is a more so an environmental one because this is the way and structure with which you raise children. So, socializing. What we mean by socializing is preparing them to engage in pro-social behaviors to develop positive relationships with people. And that's more nuanced than it sounds. And this is kind of where the split long ago occurred as far as how to approach children and upbringing and views of society. So this goes back probably further, but certainly it's codified by an informal argument or a formal argument across time between Jean-Jacques Rousseau during the Age of the Enlightenment and Hobbes in the UK, I think Scotland, in the UK, where Hobbes had a much more socialized view of children in that human beings by nature were impulsive and driven by intuition and emotions, and that society was required to rein them in and not just make them acceptable to others, but for them to actually succeed and thrive. And that in not doing so, you would have this volatile, chaotic state of violence and all this antisocial activity and suffering that you required socializing in society to actually correct these natural impulses and antisocial behaviors in order to proceed as an individual and a community towards flourishing, essentially. Rousseau, while he did endorse having a functional society, believed more so in a set it and forget it approach to let nature and children's intuitive nature and imagination function without interruption and allow them to develop on their own and experience the world as they experience it without guidance or restriction or constraint from parents. So it was two very extreme views, but over time the data, and this isn't an opinion, the data overwhelmingly suggests that Hobbes had the correct view, going back, whether it's on the societal level from analyzing hunter-gatherer and early horticultural societies and their rates of violent death and inequality and all of that compared to today, or just actual parenting, tracking them from a young age all the way into adulthood and weighing their outcomes of success as far as quality of relationships and with romantic partners and friends and family stability and economic success or career success and basically all measures likelihood to end up in prison or not. All of the measures are overwhelmingly in favor of a more of a more proactive parenting, not a set it and forget it, let the kid be the kid. And we'll talk about the nuances there. So that's primarily the role for a parent from age 2 to 4. Socialization from 2 to 4. Now it's going to extend beyond 2 to 4, but the reason why it's so important from 2 to 4 is at about age 2 to 3, in that range, kids have a little more grasp of language, and they have a little more understanding. You can actually communicate with them. They can communicate their needs. You can communicate yours, and you can start helping them understand the world as they go through it. From age 2 to 4, kids are like pure impulse. This is why they can go from insanely happy and excited, like having the most fun you've ever seen, because they're just having fun. And that's usually like their kind of default. They're just running around, exploring, seeing things, experiencing things, and they're just on this high a lot of the times. And it can be kind of a buzzkill as a parent to constantly be reining them in and be like, stop it, stop having so much fun, because they're so wild. And they're wild because they're having so much fun. They're running around, tearing the house up and jumping around and screaming and drawing things and eating things and throwing things and breaking things and having a great time. They're not trying to harm people. Well, not necessarily. They might be. But they can very quickly turn that into incredibly sad or incredibly hungry or incredibly angry, right? And they throw these tantrums. And your job as a parent is to make sure that you sort of rein them in and bring them more towards a more complacent mindset, and attitude and temperament. Because if you allow them to be just over the top and swing from side to side without concern for others, that's going to be a very negative set of characteristics to carry on into early childhood, in school, middle school, high school, and adulthood. It will not serve to your favor. So what parents have to do here's where you have to set reasonable rules that establish pro-social behaviors, like, having an inside voice, right? You can be happy, but screaming is not acceptable. Violence, unless perhaps in the form of self-defense, is not an acceptable behavior. That's a very antisocial behavior. Biting, hitting, scratching, kicking, all those things unwarranted, not for the purpose of self-defense or perhaps the defense of another, is not an acceptable behavior. And that will, of course, end you up certainly in trouble at school, expelled, possibly in a detention center, or as an adult in prison. So that's a behavior you have to correct and rein in. Other ones, you have to be considerate of others, right? You can't just eat your food, make a mess, or take somebody else's stuff. You can't steal from them. You can't pester them and annoy them when they ask you to stop. You have to stop. Those are things you have to establish, because if you don't, the kid learns to abide by those rules, and they see the world as their sort of plaything, and they carry those behaviors on, maybe not as extremely as a 2-year-old does, but they carry those on, and those are all antisocial behaviors and markers, things that will annoy people, adults and children. And even though the adults might tolerate them because they're a kid and they sort of have to, they're certainly less likely to reach out to help or aid or guide or even have over, like as a 2 kid friends coming over to the one kid's house. The parent's not going to want the terror kid to come over to their house. They're not going to get invited, and they might not even want their kid to go over to the terror kid's house because they fear the influence that might have on them. So it's going to really limit the opportunity of that kid if you don't rein in that behavior, because they're not going to get appreciation or guidance or help from adults as they grow up, and they're also going to have less friends, and they're going to experience more contention, because as they go into the school system and they misbehave and teachers enforce their rules, they don't see them as rules set in place for social order and harmony and allowing people to exchange ideas and learn and behave appropriately, not harm each other. They see the enforcer, whether it's the teacher or the police officer later or whoever, as like a villain that's just there to stop them, and as rather than like a functional social mechanism for maintaining harmony, stability, and liberty for everybody else. So if you fail to do that at this stage from 2 to 4, and the kid reaches age 4 with no socialization, you throw them out into the preschool or later kindergarten system. you've lost your opportunity, and there's actually an extensive literature on this. If your child is still gripped by antisocial behaviors, especially violent ones, by age 4, and you send them off into the world, increasingly in school, the odds that they will end up in prison are exponentially higher, extremely high relative to the norm. And that is a cycle that they often cannot escape on their own. They often end up in prison repeatedly, and they only begin to sort of pull back on that deleterious behavior that winds them up in prison starting at about age 27 and onward. And that's sort of what the literature and numbers suggest too, is that antisocial kids from ages 4 onwards, as they go out into the world, they basically just end up in prison until they're past age 27, and that's really been the only way to make sure there's not a bunch of, an excessive amount of aggression, violence, theft, etc. In society. So don't take that role lightly, because it can be a frustrating one as you are socializing. So again, the role here is to, you want to model it yourself, pro-social behaviors. You don't want to, of course, do the things that you say they shouldn't do, like when you tell them not to raise their voice or not to be aggressive or violent, and you are exuding those by yelling or throwing things or whatever. The old adage of rules for thee but not for me is not one that functions. The child's not going to learn from that. They're going to see you do it, and even though you're telling them not to, they're going to go and do it, certainly when you're not there. So you've got to sort of demonstrate or model, demonstrate, and consistently enforce a reasonable set of rules, reasonable pro-social behaviors. And what you want to do is, when antisocial behaviors emerge, you want to either punish or discourage them somehow, like the operant conditioning wise. Because you want to discourage that behavior, you want to do that immediately and consistently. That means not letting them get away with it sometimes because you're tired or you're embarrassed because someone else might be seeing another parent, or you've already done it 3 times and you're giving up. It has to be consistently, just like the findings of Skinner have suggested, it has to be consistent and immediate responses to the behavior, whether it's to discourage with punishment or to encourage with reinforcement. So again, they do something, they throw a fit, throw a tantrum, and you put them on timeout until they calm down and they can't get up. You have to do that immediately every time. Even if they get right up and do it again, you've got to send them right back to it again, which can be an incredibly frustrating and arduous and time-consuming endeavor, but it's a necessary one. And on the flip side, you always want to reward or reinforce the desired behaviors immediately as well. So, when they're waiting patiently for something, or they're behaving in public, or they ask please, or they say thank you, or they clean up after themselves, those sorts of things need to be positively or negatively reinforced immediately through praise or some other sort of reinforcement, whether it's taking away something they don't like, a negative reinforcement, or giving them something they do like a positive reinforcement, like a treat. Or for the negative reinforcement, maybe removing a chore they have to do, or something like that, for demonstrating pro-social behavior. All right, that's kind of what your role is. And like I mentioned before, there's a fairly strong set of literature that suggests what the correct path is. If your overall goal, which it should be as a parent, is to develop a child to be a pro-social person who is not denied opportunities due to their lack of control, self-control, and antisocial behavior. The primary or initial researcher that sort of looked at various parenting styles and attempted to analyze the results, there were some critics, which we'll talk about, but overall, it paints a pretty accurate picture of ways you can parent and then the outcomes of those various ways. So it was the 1950s when she started, going into the 80s. It was Diana Baumrind. And she observed a plethora of parents and tracked them on longitudinal studies and checked in later to see how these, as they progressed and later, to see how these kids turned out as far as their success goes, or net happiness or fulfillment of life. And again, the measures for that are, likelihood that they'll go to prison, dropout rates, grades, what else? Fulfillment in positive relationships with others, whether it's romantically or whether it is with just basic friendship, and then career success, college success, and onward. There were some trends. So she did some work on parenting styles. And again, we'll mention some criticisms and some contemporary revisions, but nonetheless, the initial three were influential in analyzing the development, or the behavioral development of children going on up into and through adolescence. So we're focusing again on certainly 2 to 4, but then also beyond that. So, the 5 to 17, 18 range as well, maybe beyond that for certain scenarios and situations. So there's basically 3 styles according to Baumrind. There's authoritarian. And it sounds very familiar. I don't know if you guys know history at all, but authoritarian, it's kind of like a totalitarian. They're the ones that are kind of absolute, my way or the highway, brutal enforcement. And there's authoritative, as in more so reflecting like somebody who has a lot of knowledge and know-how, and you should listen to them, and if you don't, there are going to be consequences, but reasonable ones. Authoritative. And then there's permissive, the parents who are not providing any sort of stability or structure or discipline, or at least far less, going all the way down to just being completely permissive or absent, right? And this can also, by the way, be unintentional. Like perhaps you have a fatherless household, and you have a single mother, and she has to work 2 jobs or something along those lines, and she might not be permissive herself, but she's just not able to be around as much. So these kids don't have the structure simply because they're just with their aunt or their grandma, or they're not home hardly at all because their mom's not hardly home, that sort of thing. So it can be an absent parent by choice or not by choice, as well as parents that just sort of take the Rousseauian approach of just letting the kid go and experience it and find out for themselves, which we know does not bode well. Statistically. All right, so authoritarian. These are the ones that you would probably think of as being too strict. These are absolute rulers of parents. Being strict isn't necessarily a defining characteristic, but these are the ones that are not responsive. They have absolute rules, probably rules that are a bit over the top as far as the punishment fitting the crime. Maybe they do something minor, but like, I don't know, don't say please. No, that's kind of extreme. They don't, let's say they call a kid a name, right? And that should merit some sort of punishment. But instead of like giving them a timeout and making them apologize or something like that, they like ground them for a week. All right, and let's assume it was a mild name too, like they called them dumb or something like that, which is bad, but they would just go way over the top with the enforcement. And they wouldn't explain the rules either. They'd just be, because I said so, or because I'm the parent, and they would just rule with an iron fist without question or explanation. So absolute rulers, a bit tyrannical in nature, and they are going to be defined by their lack of engagement with child. Right, so instead of explaining why we can't do that, or why we shouldn't do that, or why we should do this, it's because I said so, and they don't really give you a reason, which can be frustrating for most kids, because if you're trying to understand why you can or can't do something, because I said so is often not an adequate rationalization, one that will elicit future compliance with that rule. On the other hand, though, the authoritative parents, while they are going to be potentially strict, likely strict, they are going to provide a strict and stable structure. So rules, and they enforce those rules, and there are punishments for violating them, but there are also rewards for upholding them, right? So, and this one might also be characterized by not reinforcing the positive behaviors and only focusing on the negative. This one, though, is more open and encouraging. So you will punish and discourage certain antisocial behaviors, but you will also reinforce and encourage positive or pro-social behaviors. So strict, stable structure with a mix of reinforcement and punishment. But also, you're not just ruling with iron fist, the old "because I told you so" or "because I'm your mom" or "because I'm your dad" or whatever. You actually would, depending on the scenario, actually explain to them why there's a rule there. They might say, "Oh, I won't do that," or "that won't happen to me." Like, well, statistically, it probably will. So until you're this age or whatever, we're not going to have you do this. And tell them why that age is an appropriate age. Like, oh, well, then your motor skills are more developed, and you walking up there on that high beam is much less dangerous than it is right now. Or something like that. Strict, stable structure, reinforcement, punishment, and you are going to also explain the rules and adjust them too as the children become mature biologically, physically, in their behavior and abilities. You're more open to that. The permissive, though, as their name suggests, provide little to no structure or consistency. Oh, and this is also generally consistent. Oh, I said stable, so that's covered. Those are kind of the three general approaches. It is more of a spectrum with the extreme at one end, at the extremes at either end, and sort of a middle or slightly towards the more strict side with authoritative. But that's kind of the rough three. And what they found was, certainly with these two, some fairly consistent, valid results that corroborated the overall theory. This was the one that was a bit inconsistent, and recently, as of like the 90s and early 2000s, it's sort of been debunked to an extent, although there is a degree of truth, a shred of truth in it, which we'll talk about here in a second. So let's first start with these two, because we have pretty clear results. These two have drastically different outcomes. The permissive parents often have children that are not successful across the board. So these are kids that are generally far more impulsive, and that's not a good thing. Going out and doing whatever you want because you want to isn't always, in fact, it usually isn't the best idea. It can cause you to harm others or harm yourself in the future by abusing substances or engaging in activities that are too risky, or neglecting or shirking responsibilities like your finances or your education or your job, whatever it might be. They're more impulsive. They are often less fulfilled or happy in adulthood. They often have strained relationships, whether it be romantic or just friendship-based, non-sexual friendship-based. They are also going to be impulsive, less fulfilled, strained relationships. Oh, they're much more likely to engage in the following or suffer from the following negative developments. More likely to end up in prison, dropping out of high school, get divorced. They're more likely to, what else do they suffer from? They have less career success. And they are statistically more likely to be, to exhibit antisocial behaviors. Obviously the worst of those being violence and aggression, which they are also more aggressive, I should add that as well. Whether it's physically or relationally, although the physical one tends to get you in more trouble more quickly. All right, so those are the negative outcomes. And again, one thing I want to mention here, though, since temperament is actually quite important, as it's largely genetically driven, so your degree of fulfilledness and complacency and orderliness and interests are largely genetically driven. So, for example, I could be someone who's naturally rather calm and considerate, or studious and orderly, and even though my parents aren't there or they provide me no structure, I end up being successful anyway, just because I happened to be predisposed to be that way based on my temperament and personality, which is genetic. But I'm much more likely to succumb to developmental failures as far as reining in my impulsivity and being considerate of others and reining in my aggression and antisocial behavior. So again, if I naturally sort of am predisposed to avoid those things, which can happen, this won't be as much of a factor. But if it's someone who's borderline or is inclined to have these things and they're not corrected over time, you end up with a much worse result. Authoritative, though, providing a strict, stable structure and reinforcing pro-social behaviors and punishing or discouraging antisocial has some immense benefits. It's basically the opposite of almost every statistic here. They're less likely to suffer from these detriments, so they're less likely to be imprisoned, drop out, exhibit antisocial behaviors, etc. They're often happier and more successful in relationships and career and just life in general. They're also generally more confident too. Because part of this, and I actually didn't mention this, is encouragement. Authoritative parents encourage their children to foster independence, to go out and try things and to be resilient in the face of a challenge or adversity or a failure. Not showing them that it doesn't show that they are a failure, but a failure is a learning mechanism with which they can use to grow and improve, and that's how humans operate. No one just rolls out and starts wrecking everything first try all the way until they die. People fail often, or there are others who just happen to be better at it, and you've got to put in a fair amount of time and effort to close the gap with that person or exceed them or whatever it might be. Authoritative parents are generally much better at doing that with their encouragement. And they'll do realistic encouragement too, like, yeah, you lost and that person's better, but here's how you get better. Whereas a permissive parent that's either not there to give them encouragement, the kid might think that they're a failure, or they might be the permissive, like overly compassionate parent who just gives them whatever they want and doesn't ever stop them and says, no, you're the best anyway, and just outright lies to them. And so they go on thinking they are the best and develop this sort of delusion of grandeur and narcissism that they're the best, and if you beat them, it's because you cheated or you're a bad person. So there's a big difference there. Baumann's initial findings asserted that these parents who are authoritarian actually, what's the word I'm looking for? Impaired social development and confidence. But there have been quite a few longitudinal studies done since the 1990s and early 2000s on some populations that generally tend to be more authoritarian. There's some studies from several East Asian cultures that have far more authoritarian parenting styles, as well as some in the Muslim communities, and I think some Jewish communities as well. I might be mixing one of those up, but they looked at several populations that have much more authoritarian type parenting styles, and they didn't really notice in the long run, assuming of course they're not, inducing physical violence and trauma and pain and abuse. That would obviously negatively impact their development. But we're talking about parents that are overly strict and maybe don't reason with the kids or whatever. It actually shows to have very negligible impact on their overall success and outcome. So certainly this is a beneficial approach and backed by data. This is also a detrimental approach, which is equally backed by data. So this is the direction you want to lean in, this is the direction you want to avoid. You have to find that balance. Too much compassion or too much negligence is going to result in greatly increasing the odds of your child not being successful, whereas providing structure and encouragement and a balanced degree of empathy and encouraging resilience actually prepares them best for the future. And going a little bit too on the strict end or the absolute end doesn't appear to have much of a negative or positive impact on the success of the adult in the long run. And again, that's according to several high population longitudinal studies coming out of cultures that have authoritarian parenting styles. But these ones were corroborated by later findings. This one was more so disputed. But those are the three that you may have to talk about on the actual AP test. So one of the important things I want to mention here while on this topic is this is an increasingly common American parenting style. Not so much in Europe and other parts of the world, but this is an increasingly popularized American one. And there's a lot of research coming from several people, but certainly a psychologist named Dr. Jonathan Haidt. He started his work, I believe, in the late 80s, and he's still going to now. He had a lot of work about parenting that's overly protective. And I don't even mean permissive, because this can mean protective or permissive. In fact, I want to actually put an arrow there. He had some research on a topic that was coined. It wasn't by him. It was by there's actually some engineer that coined the term. But they did some research, and no one's been able to counter their claim despite attempts to. It's been upheld that humans are actually, and children as they develop, are actually what's called anti-fragile as they develop. Now, fragile means you break. Like if I dropped a glass, this is roughly speaking the analogy it gives. Fragile means you break. So if I drop a glass, it just shatters. Now it's broken and I can't use it. Something that's got a fixed shape, like a plastic cup, it's like I drop that, but it doesn't change. So, giving it resistance doesn't actually affect it at all. It doesn't change at all. So I drop the plastic cup, it just stays the same. Providing resistance or force to a glass, though, can break it, damage it, can't use it forever. Humans are like neither of those things. So one's fragile and then one's not fragile, it's robust. Anti-fragile actually is a unique term, which means it won't, assuming that the damage doesn't break it, like literally kill it, or traumatize it beyond repair, actually presenting the entity with some adversity or resistance actually causes that entity to grow, become stronger over time. It's much like another good analogy would be muscles. You're not going, if you use steroids you will, but assuming you're not using steroids and you're trying to build muscle mass the traditional way, the anatomically correct way, you can't get stronger just by thinking about things. You have to go out and actually strain your muscles to the point that they actually break a little bit. So you're putting stress on them to the point that testing them causes your body to respond to that stress and strain, that damage actually, that light amount of damage, by building it back and repairing it, not to the same as it was, but actually a little bit stronger and a little bit better than it was before. And you do this repeatedly across the weeks, across the months, across the years, and after one day of doing this, you look exactly the same, but doing that consistently and properly across the week and allowing rest, you'll look like a whole different person afterwards, because your muscles have been strained constantly, recovered, strained constantly, recovered, and grown to become more robust. So anti-fragile actually means resistance is required for growth and durability. It's not only do your muscles grow, but they can actually handle a higher load now, right? So that's what the increasing weight is. You might if you're a typical high school guy or whatever, you might start out with a 135 bench, or maybe that's even too hard for you. But if you properly do your whatever your weights class is for the right year, and you get the nutrition and the rest, you do it across the entire year, you're going to be benching way more than 135 by the end of it, because you've been straining and stressing your muscles. They've grown and they're now more durable and actually more powerful, so you can actually lift higher amounts. Human beings are the same way, and it's also like the immune system too. If I'm protected from the outside world by a bubble, I'm kept in a room and no pathogens are ever let in, sure, I won't die because no pathogens come in. But as soon as I go out into the world and my immune system's never been tested before and has no antibodies and has no experience and a lack of resources and practice, I am way, way, way more vulnerable to infection if I have never been exposed to it before. So even though sicknesses over time, just like building weights is a strain, is actually a negative experience at the time, once you recover from it, the exposure actually made you stronger because now you actually have experience in your immune system. It's got more antibodies and memory cells to fight future infections. So anti-fragile means expose it in order for it to become stronger and grow. And that's actually what humans are actually like. So parents, regardless of the style that they're using, permissive parents probably wouldn't be either they're not there or they're overly compassionate to their children. They want to protect them from any negative experiences. You're actually supposed to encourage your child to go out and try things and risk failing. Because as they familiarize themselves with situations and they understand them, so they're not anxious about them because they already understand them, they know that they've done them, and they gain experience and their competency grows and they get better, you actually you program and start this sort of snowball effect of developing a mentally resistant and competent child, one who's used to facing unknown situations and adversity, uncomfortable situations, ones that might be displeasing in some way, like giving a speech or getting into an argument with somebody, or going into a competition which they could lose, right? Not get a participation trophy, but they could actually just lose and not get anything. As they deal with those things, they become accustomed to them, and they learn that that's not the end of my world. I can actually survive it, and I can actually learn from it, improve and grow stronger. So we should actually foster independence by encouraging and sort of, not literally pushing, but encouraging and pushing kids forward right to the edge of where they are comfortable. So not too much, like you're exposing them to too much and they get overwhelmed, they can't handle it. That might traumatize them and they'd be afraid to try new things. But you have to expose them to things that are like optimally difficult, like they're just within their range of ability or difficulty or understanding, to the point that it's hard for them and they're going to struggle and they might fail, but overall they can learn from it or they can succeed and overcome it and benefit from it. So that finding that midpoint of encouragement and exposure, and even a little push metaphorically here and there, is a beneficial thing, even if the child experiences anxiety or discomfort or tries to avoid it. You should actually, it's your job as a parent to encourage them to do it, and not overprotect, overcoddle, censor them, and well, I already said coddle, but try to make the world too perfect or nice for them. They're called snowplow parents, by the way, as in like, instead of the kid having to go out and dig his own, shovel his own driveway or road and figure out how to drive in the snow and all that and deal with the hardships, but learn from it, the parent just snow plows the road and the kid just walks on it with no idea how to deal with a situation where their parent isn't there, but they have snow in their way. So anti-fragile. And this actually is in line with another developmental psychologist, an early one, unintentionally. There's a guy named Lev Vygotsky. It's very much in line with this spirit, Vygotsky. He suggested there was an optimal degree of difficulty for students to learn and grow from. So this is the idea, Haidt's idea, this modern one, is the idea that we should stray away from this overly compassionate, permissive parenting where we're overprotecting children and sort of force them to engage in things that are uncomfortable so they get accustomed to it and grow. Vygotsky kind of said a similar thing about learning. You should not give kids something that's too easy to learn because they'll become bored with it and then they're not going to benefit or grow from learning something they already know or something that's too easy. But if you overwhelm them by giving them something too complex or too difficult, they'll be discouraged because they can't understand it and they'll give up and they'll think they're stupid or whatever it might be. So when you're trying to get somebody to learn something, it should be information or a topic or a task that is difficult but doable. Maybe they require some guidance and some help from a peer or a teacher, but it's something that they could actually do on their own, even if it requires a bit of help. It doesn't mean do it for them, but as a teacher or a parent or even an individual child, you should be giving your child or student, or you yourself giving yourself, tasks and objectives or learning goals that are almost out of reach but not quite out of reach, that require a great degree of effort, difficulty, discomfort, perhaps some guidance and advice from others, but it's something you can do and grow and learn from. And that was what he referred to as the zone of proximal learning. And it's sort of a sweet spot where, too easy, you have no growth, and you're also not encouraged to learn because it's boring and it's quick. And in fact, you actually get so used to successfully knowing it that you avoid things that are difficult because you might not learn them easily or quickly. But if you go with something that's too difficult, far beyond their ability, that will discourage them because they might think that they're not capable, or they're not good enough, or there's no point in trying. It's sort of a learned helplessness thing. If I can't affect the outcome, then why would I even try to do anything? You have to find this sort of middle ground where it's still difficult, and this is where the zone of proximal learning was to him. Here's the zone. Oh, I forgot the word zone there perfectly without trying. This is the area of optimal difficulty. Difficult, a strain, perhaps uncomfortable, whatever the skill or topic might be, maybe requires some help, but you are able to do it by yourself, or with minimal guidance on your own, and learn and grow from it. That's what the zone of proximal development was. Haidt's a recent guy, he's still active, and he's pushing this, and it's not just his opinion, by the way, it's backed by the research of him and his peers. It's well documented. It's got a what's the word I'm looking for? A broad set of convincing data to suggest that American parenting, especially in the recent generation or two, has been too overly compassionate, too protective, to the point that they're actually making their children vulnerable to trying new things, and actually have shown statistical increases not only in the diagnoses of depression, anxiety, and other mood disorders, but also admittance to hospital for self-harm. So it's not just people are more open and accepting and willing to share their mental illnesses, or psychological disorders, but they're also actually doing them to the point that they're not just saying it, they're doing it. It's a real phenomenon. It's not just more people are admitting it, it's more people are actually engaging in the harmful, self-harmful activities and being admitted to hospitals, starting with the millennial generation and here into Gen Z as well. So that's why he's fighting that campaign and trying to get parents to expose their kids and encourage them to try things that are difficult and face some adversity and speak with somebody who disagrees with them and live. And then Lev Vygotsky's research back from the 1930s sort of sends the same message about what you're doing, your goals, your learning should be optimally challenging, difficult and strenuous, but possible to do. If they're too hard, it discourages you, and if they're too easy, it discourages you also, because you don't want to try anything hard because you're used to just winning and it being easy the whole time.